an hour of truth for the battered but proud people of the Empire State. From the financial and entertainment epicenter of New York City to the sleeping and empty small cities and towns of upstate, which once bustled with manufacturing, mining, and farming. We all know from inspiration, history, and nature, we deserve a return to the success and growth of generations past, a birthright being squandered by corruption in Albany, and the depredations of an insecure, scheming mountebank posing as governor, who loathes both us and himself. As liberty beckoned to enslaved peoples behind the Iron Curtain via American broadcasts after World War II, we now say, believe, rise, and join us. Welcome to Radio Free New York.
All right, welcome everyone. You're listening to Radio Free New York. I'm Kevin Wilson. I'm in hosting for Andrew Hollister today, and we have a guest, not in studio because we're doing good social distancing and whatnot, as everyone does. But we have a guest. He's from New York City. He is the vice chair of the Libertarian National Committee and is also a former U.S. Senate candidate for New York State. He is Alex Merced. Alex, welcome.
Hey, Kev. How you been? Thanks for having me on the show.
I've been great. Yeah, no, thanks for coming on. This has been awesome. We haven't been able to talk in forever, but guys, Alex is great, and he's a superstar in the Libertarian Party. And I still have his poster up in my room for those of you who are watching on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks everyone for joining us. I got the campaign banner sign up there, but I brought in Alex Merced today to talk about what's going on with the Federal Reserve, because Sean Phelan and I tried to talk about this on Friday's show, which if you go into our podcast thing, you can see it's titled "The Fed Just Did What with $1.5 trillion." And John and I tried to talk about it, and I felt like I didn't quite do the topic justice, but Alex Merced here, he has a podcast. And you want to plug it real quick? What's your podcast?
Well, I mean, the podcast, you'll actually find it under a lot of different names on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. But if you just look up Alex Merced or the Alex Merced Cast, you'll find it. Subscribe, and there's a lot of other cool podcasts that I do that are on there. So just look up my name. You'll find all the stuff that I do on YouTube, on iTunes, on Stitcher, etc.
Yes, Alex does a million different things, and I did have the opportunity to listen to your podcast the other day about what the Federal Reserve is doing, and so I wanted to ask you, what the heck is going on?
Okay, so basically what's going on is that the Fed is cutting, they're doing lots of different things, and then I just heard that they were doing a round of quantitative easing. So first, let's just kind of establish what these different policies are. So the Fed has a lot of tools to what's called monetary policy, and I'm going to try to be very nuanced about it so people can really appreciate the nuances of these different policies. So when they say that the Fed cuts rates, they're usually talking about a rate called the discount rate. And the way the discount rate works is that there's a policy that the Fed also sets called the reserve requirement. The reserve requirement is the amount of money that a bank has to kind of put to the side. So imagine that if I'm a bank and I have $1 million worth of liabilities on my balance sheet, I have to have $100,000 put to the side, 10%. Okay, and they check that at the end of every day. So
banks can't just give out all their money; they have to keep a little bit set aside at the end of every day.
Correct. So this is just to kind of prevent the system ever being completely out of cash, theoretically. And there's some interesting things that actually before the Federal Reserve existed, banks actually kept more in reserve than they do now. So actually, technically, this policy, the existence of the Fed actually has reduced the overall level of reserves that banks keep. But that's another discussion we might get into later.
Maybe. I mean, this is a whole hour to nerd out on Fed policy and banking policy.
Oh, I can definitely do that.
I want to. Yeah, we got a while to do it, so might as well, right?
Okay. So that discount rate. So basically, the bank has to keep 10%. Now, if at the end of the day, the bank doesn't have that money, it doesn't just go out of business. It would if it doesn't do anything about it. But what happens is that the banks will actually reach out to other banks in what's referred to as the Fed funds market. And some banks actually have extra money. They have more than their 10%. So the banks that have more than 10% reserves lend the money to the banks that have less than 10% reserves. And then they literally do that loan overnight. But every once in a while, every bank has lent way too much money. So they can't borrow from each other because there's no bank with extra money. In that situation, you go to the Federal Reserve, and they have this thing called the discount window, where they lend money to the bank at the discount rate. So the easiest way, the simple way of thinking about it is to think of that's the kind of a penalty rate. It's kind of like the punishment. That rate is like the punishment you get because the banking system overdid it. So the higher it is, the bigger the punishment it is to the banking system for overlending or kind of overextending themselves. So by lowering it to zero, basically they're saying banks just lend money. Just don't worry about it. If you overdo it,
there's no
we got
penalty.
you.
If you overdo it, not a big deal. Just do it, give it, and they give it back the next day.
Yep, and then just reborrow it each day. So.
Right, and I mean, like, what was a normal like discount rate look like? I mean, if it's 0% right now, and they're due.
I mean, you'll find people who do like historical averages. I want to say like the historical average maybe like around 3%. I don't know. I wouldn't quote that. I wouldn't say I can say that with 100% confidence, but it's been historically low for like the last 10 years. Because I mean, it went down to 0% during the whole crisis in 2008, and then over the last couple of years, they've been bringing it back up. Not because they felt horribly confident in the economy, but just because the Fed wanted to have some wiggle room to go back to zero in case something like this happened.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because that's what I've seen talked about a lot on different kind of banking policy shows that I try to catch a minute of and not understand any of, is that, like, the Fed will talk about increasing rates by like 0.25% or 0.05%, whatever it is, like a very small percentage in my mind. And, they keep wanting to crank it up just a little bit. And that's to like slow down the economy some. And so now they've done that a little bit, although it's still it was at a historic low even before what's happened in the last few weeks, right?
Oh, correct. It is still at historical low. They were raising it very slowly. I mean, technically, monetary policy has been very tepid over the last 20 years. Because I mean, if you go back to like pre the 90s, interest rates would go up like full percentage points regularly at the drop of a hat with Federal Reserve policy. Like Paul Volcker raised the rates multiple percent pretty quickly to fight inflation back in the early 80s and late 70s. So. And the same thing with tax policy. I mean, you used to have huge changes in tax policy, like 30%. Now you see like people argue over 1 or 2% changes. But what happens is basically when the Fed has been raising rates for the last couple of years, one way to kind of imagine it is kind of like someone basically refilling the bullets in their gun. They're doing it so that way they have those bullets there later. But the problem is the mechanism, the idea behind it, is that you're trying to change expectations. Because at the end of the day, how people spend money is based on people. Like, you can sit there and print all the money in the world, but if everyone's super scared, they're not going to spend it. And then also, since you've done it before, you've changed your expectations for the next go-around. It's not going to have the same psychological effect. And that's the problem with, like, policy stimulus, is that even if it has worked once or twice in the past, every time you do it, it works less. Because people begin to expect it, and their behavior isn't altered as much.
They plan for like that stimulus to happen.
Correct. So it's priced in.
Right. So so I could see how that could in a way. And one thing I want to establish with our listeners, you hear the Fed, that's of course the Federal Reserve Bank. And Alex, is the Federal Reserve Bank controlled by the federal government?
It's not controlled by the federal government. It's not necessarily really like a private company either. Like, people always get this kind of mixed up. So a little history on the Federal Reserve. Before 1913, there was no central bank in the United States. We did have other central banks in the history, so a total of 4 different central banks. But what happened was you had the panic in 1907, and basically the economy you used to have frequent banking panics. The reason being is that back in those days, there was really strict local regulations on banks that limited how far expanded banks could be. So literally every bank had like one location. So that means if the local economy had a hiccup, that bank went out of business. And banks do a lot of lending with each other. So if one bank went out of business, it took out another bank, and then people got scared and when they heard about those banks going out of business, so they pulled money out of their bank, and it just became this sort of contagion that would spread. So when the banking panic happened in 1907, you had people like JP Morgan, who would kind of bail out the economy once in a while, and he was getting kind of older at that point and thinking, okay, I'm not going to be around to bail out the economy anymore. So he started kind of instigating with Senator Aldrich, which later became the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, which we can delve deeper in as we go along.
Yeah, no, we only have a few seconds left, and yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about the Federal Reserve. Always a big hot topic with kind of libertarians and a few conservatives and whatnot too. But it's important to get a refresher on that, and we want the Radio Free New York audience to understand what's going on and what does all this stuff mean. So again, we're joined by Alex Merced today, and we will be back here in just a few minutes on Radio Free New York. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back in a few.
You're listening to Radio Free New York.
Welcome back to Radio Free New York. I'm Kevin Wilson, guest hosting today for Andrew Hollister. Fortunately, don't have Sean, Agent of Chaos, in the studio today, but I do have Alex Merced. But thanks everyone again who's listening. We are not live today, but we do appreciate your comments. If you're listening to us on Facebook, or you're listening to us on YouTube, or listen to us on Twitter, or wherever you're listening to us, leave us a comment. I know I'm very active on Facebook today. I'm sure Alex will be too. And we'd love to answer your questions and do any follow-ups. And of course, you can email us too at contact@radiofreenewyork.com. But if you are joining us today and you're listening on WYSL or the rebroadcast on WENY or WACK, thanks again. Alex Merced, the Vice Chair of the Libertarian National Committee and former U.S. Senate candidate in New York State. And we are talking about the Federal Reserve. And you're kind of talking about how it got started there and just some of the history of how like the rates have been manipulated over time. But why do kind of libertarians and conservatives and money people get all riled up about the Federal Reserve? Like what's to be mad about?
There's a lot of things.
If anything.
There's a lot of things to be concerned about from sort of a structural perspective. Like, on paper, the Federal Reserve is created to be an independent organization. The idea is supposed to be separated from political interests. And to some extent, it has less direct political influence than a lot of other parts of the government, even though it's not a part of the government. But who the chairman is, appointed by the president. Who most of the board of governors are, appointed by the president. So basically, the Federal Reserve has all these different pieces. So you have the board of governors, who are like the regulatory part, and they make a lot of the rules. Those are all appointed by the president. Then you have you have all the different Fed banks across the country that represent different regions of the bank. And the way those banks work is that different tiers of large, small, and medium banks will then elect board members, and then those board members then elect the president of each one of those banks. And it's the presidents of those Fed regional banks and the board of governors that are appointed by the president. They're the ones essentially setting this monetary policy through what's called the Federal Open Market Committee. So basically, who are the two big influences that have all the influence over monetary policy? The banking industry and the politicians. So, I mean, for the average Joe, that can be very concerning because those are the interests who are represented. And on top of it, like, they control sort of how money, in a sense, is kind of entered into the economy. And one thing to think about is, like, it's not just how much money there is in the economy, it's how it gets into the economy. Wherever the money starts tends to cause sort of misallocations of power. Like, basically, you're just going to see sort of power accumulate at that point. So imagine that right now, the way we put money into the economy is the Fed does what's called open market operations. They literally just they make money out of thin air. They're not literally like printing it, but they're just saying they have it. Like, imagine if I could just go and increase my bank account limit by
it doesn't just work like that meme going around, money machine go brr.
No, much quicker.
It's not quite like that.
No, that takes too long. Now here you just move the decimal point over one. It's like, oh, now I have a trillion. So
that sounds super convenient.
Yeah, lovely computers. So what happens though is they'll take that money and then they're gonna buy government debt from banks. And that's a system that's kind of evolved over the years, which creates two problems. One, the money is entering directly through the banking system. There's a decent reason for that. The idea is that you don't want to just give the money out because government's not really good at picking who gets the money. banks lend the money out for interest, so they have an incentive of trying to figure out who are sort of the best people to lend to. So it's kind of like they do have an incentive to kind of figure out where the best places to put that money by the nature of their business model. But still, it creates a huge sort of power imbalance or power influence in the banking sector. And then two, because they buy government debt, it makes it really easy for the government to write up huge deficits, which creates a lot of governance issues where politicians don't care about debt, they don't care about deficits, and that creates a pressure that does have inflationary pressures down the road, and not even just inflationary pressures, because inflation can be a sort of it's kind of a, sometimes it's there, sometimes it isn't kind of thing, which isn't really the main reason why this is bad. What's really bad is that it changes sort of all the signals in the economy, because when you're playing with interest rates, it's like imagine if oil suddenly became more scarce. We'd expect that the price of gas would go up. Because the price of gas goes up, we will drive less, we'll use less gas, but there'll still be enough gas for everybody because everyone will kind of adjust their usage. So prices kind of signal people how to use the stuff that's available, so we don't overuse it. Now, if you reduce the cost of borrowing money to a point that artificially reflects the actual supply of goods and services in the economy, then you're going to start having people sort of allocate their time and resources in ways that incorrectly reflects what's going on. It's kind of like if that situation where you had very little oil and we don't let oil prices go up, people will just keep using oil and you'll run out of oil.
Just consume it faster than would be able to be supplied appropriately.
Correct. So in this situation, what happens is that people start investing their money in the wrong places, because people are going to invest their money either way, but based on the interest rates, certain business models will make more sense than others. And now you're investing it sort of in the wrong businesses that then the economy kind of blows up later.
So if it's like cheap to borrow money, then it's easier to make riskier investments. Is that kind of what you're saying?
In part. Like a good example is after 2008, interest rates were lowered to like now, like to 0%. But also at the same time, there was a very high price of oil. So oil was at a really high price because of a variety of different factors. So suddenly it made a lot of sense to borrow money at really low rates, drill for oil, and then sell it at a really high price. But the thing is that it made so much sense, a lot of people did it. And then what happens when all those people did it and they brought that oil to market, what happens to the price of oil? It goes back down, and now those profits you thought were there are no longer there. So a lot of those loans went bad. So a lot of regional banks got hurt. A lot of those oil companies ended up having to sell off to other people. And that's kind of what happens. It's basically what happened with the housing market. Low rates, high growing prices of housing made it look too good an idea to too many people at the same time. So
buying a house seemed like a really good investment. You get that. You can, maybe sell it down the road or whatever, and maybe that's not such a good investment after all.
Correct. Because what happens is that at that point, the numbers make sense. But when everyone does it at the same time, the numbers change down the road. And then you realize, and if rates were at a more natural rate of interest that reflected actual supply and demand, there probably would have still been investment in housing, but it wouldn't have been such that misallocation where, and the thing is that that would have gone somewhere else. So somewhere else didn't get enough investment. So somewhere else we're lacking something.
Huh. So that's what, when I hear people smarter than me talk about like malinvestment, that's what they're talking about?
Correct. Basically, we're just steering it into the wrong places.
Right. Because we're not letting price signals, normal market signals, let us determine what's the best place to use that money and to use those resources that are scarce.
Yeah, and the problem at this point is the government's been manipulating price signals via monetary policy, via tax policy for so long. What would actual prices look like? What does actual supply and demand at this point? I mean, it's anyone's guess, really. I mean, it would take years for it to kind of retro back to a point where it actually reflects reality.
Yeah, that's something I think about a lot is like, if we have people who are running on a smaller government platform, they're running on a free market platform. How do you start to pull this apart? How do you start to say like, well, where do we start with getting us back to a type of economy that makes sense, where we can trust the market signals a bit more effectively? Because can we trust it in some of these cases?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more doable than it seems. The problem is generally the places where it's easiest to pull back government are the places where you're not going to restore the market the most. So really, what you have to really get, everyone's like, oh, we want to repeal welfare first, or we want to repeal or reduce the size of the military. And while those are good things, we want to reduce the size of the government because the government budget creates a deficit that pushes up interest rates or crowds out profits and has a lot of other negative effects. The parts that are going to restore sort of market pricing is going to be a lot more sort of on the regulatory and tax side. And those are harder places because people assume that if the government doesn't set rules just magically don't exist. But they do. I always say that rules are something that we naturally demand. It's not like absent government, there'll be no rules. I mean, when we play board games with our family, there wouldn't be any fun if there wasn't any rules. But the reason why
you don't call the cops on someone if they break the rules, is that just my family?
Oh yeah. And exactly, that's the other thing. You could have rules and doesn't necessarily mean they're enforced or followed. It just gives you a false sense of security. So it goes both ways. So rules do get figured out through diverse institutions, insurance companies, community organizations, stuff like that. But you need to start leaving more rules in that realm, and the government needs to kind of take hands off a little bit more. But it's a hard case to make.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like that it's going to be a tough case to make, especially since that's you just took a couple minutes to explain that, and trying to get that out in like a 30-second soundbite is a bit difficult to make the case for why can we operate in a system that doesn't have certain government rules that creates these bad incentives? How do we how do we move away from the perceived security of having a government imposed system of rules that may create distortions in the market?
100% agreed.
Yeah. All right. Well, we are coming up on another break. Again, we're joined by Alex Merced here on Radio Free New York. Thanks again, everyone, for listening today. We will be back in just a few minutes for more show. Talk to you then.
You're listening to Radio Free New York.
Welcome back. You're listening to Radio Free New York. I'm Kevin Wilson, again, your host for the day. And we are joined by Alex Merced, the vice chair of the Libertarian National Committee. And we're talking Fed policy. And, in the break, Alex and I were talking about, I want to make sure that we're understanding a few different terms and make sure. So we got our definition of what the Fed is. I think we got that down. I think we got overnight rates. I think we covered that. And I don't know if we hit it yet, but what is, when I think of like printing money, like is quantitative easing that, like, is that the moving the decimal place? Is that what quantitative easing is?
Yes. And basically there's two types. So you have to be careful what the Fed's talking about. When they use the term quantitative easing, or they may use the term doing a repo. And the difference is temporary versus permanent. Mm-hmm. So when they're doing a repo, they're buying government bonds from the banks, but they're doing it for like a night, 2 nights. So
is that what's going on with that $1.5 trillion and they did the $500 billion? Is that the repo thing?
I think they actually did use the word quantitative easing, and when they say that means that's them pulling out the big guns, because now they're going to the bank and saying, hey, we're going to buy these things from you permanently. Because what happens is that when you do it temporarily, the bank's not going to take much risk with it because they know they have to give it back pretty quickly. But when they buy it permanently for long periods of time, then you're basically telling the bank, hey, go have some fun with this money. Just go do stuff. So that's a much bigger move, and that signals a much bigger fear from the Fed. And oftentimes, and that's the thing with the Fed, is like if they act too aggressively, that can hurt the market as much as help it, because then they're signaling to the market that they're very scared, and then the market gets scared.
And then do you think that's what happened? I mean, we saw like a massive drop off in the market. This is airing Friday, but on what, Monday of this week, and that was after what I thought was a repo operation. Maybe it's not, but that was after that, over the weekend, or Friday, rather, Thursday, Friday, the previous week. Things are happening so fast now. I'm trying to keep track of it all. But yeah, we saw a massive drop. And so you think like if the Fed takes a big action like that, that can actually scare investors to think like, oh man, this is so serious.
Yeah, it does. It's like not doing anything during a crisis can tank the markets, because then markets will, if they expect the Fed to act, which they've kind of gotten them accustomed to it over the years, then that's one of the problems with the Fed, that it creates a sort of expectation of aid every time there's a problem. So it's kind of like if your parents bailed you out a few times, and then next time you do something wrong, you expect your parents to bail you out again. Then that'll cause the market to drop. But then if you do it too much, you're like, man, is it that bad that you need to help this much? That also causes. So, and the problem is everything's happening so fast, it's causing dramatic action, and that dramatic action is creating more panic. And it's creating this kind of weird spiral that's really scary. Because I mean, when I look out the door, the world doesn't seem that scary around me, but when I watch the news, it's like the world's ending. So it's having its effect, and then the Fed then responds to it, and the problem is you don't know what the effect of Fed policy is. So like there's like a 6-month lag, so if they overdid it, we won't find out till it's too late.
So we're gonna find out we're in trouble like a year from now, like, oh wow, they really messed up here.
But although, like, things are so odd right now. Like, what is worse? It's like I don't know what's bad or good anymore. I don't know how to judge the world these days.
Yeah, no, it's tough. And I see these situations, and I always say this on this show, is that like I think there's the Federal Reserve, I think, is a political body. Like it responds to politics in some ways, and it responds to the wishes of like the president. And I think that what politicians want to do now is they want to look like they're doing something. They want to look like they're taking action, and giving the appearance of them taking action is more important than making sure it's the right action.
Agreed.
What do you think about that? Because obviously you're someone who pays some attention to politics, being part of the Libertarian National Committee. Do you think that's what's going on here? Or?
That's exactly right. A lot of people are taking big moves because they're scared of what happens if they're seen not taking a big move, or if someone else takes a big move and they don't. So it's kind of like this like match, this arm wrestling match between Cuomo and De Blasio over shelter in place. It's just like everyone's trying to be sort of that politician, and the problem is that causes trying to be the person who stands in leadership at the right time can sometimes cause more panic. Sometimes leadership is not bold action. Sometimes leadership is making sure that people are calm and reassuring people, that giving people a vision of where things get better, so that way they can continue life as normal and make the right steps to get things back on track. I think this is going to be, like, looking at the crisis, this is an interesting situation, because while for a lot of people this isn't necessarily like a huge crisis, I mean, when you take a look at people who are in sort of the most what's the word I'm looking for, the high risk classes, there are a lot of people, and then I think we're seeing it's possible that they can get the disease if you're in those.
Yeah, I read that earlier, which
makes this really difficult. Really difficult to think through, because how you can't stop the world forever, but I mean, for those people, it's a real risk.
Yeah, it's a real risk. I mean, but we're sitting here in New York State, and the bars are closed, the restaurants are closed. I'm a digital marketer, but and we've seen businesses that are like, all right, we gotta stop everything now. So like, what are the long-term ramifications for the businesses I'm part of? How do we sustain this indefinitely? And what we seem to be getting out of this is like really big sweeping solutions that are coming quick and fast, and part of those solutions are shut everything down. And then what I want to ask you about is what some of those other solutions are, which is throw money at the problem.
And that's what they're doing. They're going to be doing this, like, they just signed one relief bill, which I think is going to be more like helping small businesses and covering people for lost work. But then there's also the whole discussion of sort of like this pseudo UBI and whatnot. And the thing is that, like, the economy can be resilient if people are free enough. The problem right now is, and the reason why something like a UBI may sound compelling to some, is because right now we're in a situation where they're literally shutting down the economy. They're literally telling people they cannot do anything. So no one has the flexibility to do much outside of what they do on their computer, which I do think is going to be, at the end of the day, the internet's going to be what saves the day. I'm hoping that people take this opportunity as a time to learn new skills, develop new business models, to shift a lot of what we do beyond like physical goods into newer, more digital models. And I think this kind of hopefully will cause, well, it's going to cause some cultural changes that in the long run are okay as far as, again, shifting in our business models. I'm more scared of the social impact, like far as how we'll treat each other. I don't think social distancing is just going to go away the minute they say this thing's over. People are going to get accustomed to that.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, well, especially if they're talking about like, you know, maybe this goes to July or August. There's a thing that came out of England earlier this week too, and like, no, this is going to be an 18-month thing until we get a vaccine. Shoot, well, A, we can't shut down the economy that long. It's just that ain't gonna work. B, you know, again, you know, how do we adapt a life where I can't go see my friends in person? You know, I can't go play volleyball, play board games with my friends. I'm supposed to stay away from them. You know, I'm only going to be interacting with people through you know, Zoom or something.
Yeah. Thank God for Zoom, though. I mean, you know.
I mean, it's great.
Yeah, no,
I mean, like we're very lucky to live in an age where we have this stuff, you know, where I can conduct business with Google Hangouts. I can meet with my whole team every morning and see their faces and, you know, see that they didn't get dressed today and stuff. No, but all that stuff is it's a good connection to have, that if this were to happen in like 1992,
it would be pretty bad.
Be pretty bad. And you don't have like Netflix and Hulu and whatnot to crash on either. That's,
yeah, no, I mean, but basically the government is causing sort of a paralysis that's going to, like, limits people's ability to be resilient in this time. And then on top of that, the spending of these funds, like, I can understand sort of the impulse to spend these funds, the impulse for relief. If there was a time where it kind of seemed justified, probably now is where you can almost make the best case, because it's such an exogenous event. It's such an event from the outside, unexpected kind of thing. But that's the reason why, you know, discipline matters so much during the times where you don't have crises like this. And there has been no discipline as far as how we've spent, the deficits, the spending, you know, just because you're in a crisis now.
I want to keep that thread going, because I do want to talk about that when we come back, because I think that's really important. But we do have to go to a break in just a few minutes. Again, thanks everyone for listening here on Radio Free New York. We're here with Alex Merced talking Fed policy. We're talking about spending policy and whatnot too. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Talk to you soon.
You're listening to Radio Free New York.
Hey, welcome back to Radio Free New York. I'm Kevin Wilson, your host today, and I'm again joined by Alex Merced, the Vice Chair of the Libertarian National Committee. And we're talking about spending, and one of the things I want to hit on, because this is something that's been concerning me a lot lately, is, gosh, at least libertarians and the old Tea Party conservatives back when I was first becoming an adult, like, we've been talking about the federal debt and deficit and all that stuff for at least a decade now, and I know that's been going on for even a while before that. But no, we never resolved that. Like that never actually, we never actually got in a position where we're able to get serious about making spending cuts and get serious about controlling the federal debt. And now we're in a position where maybe we do need to spend a lot more money. Alex, is our country in a more precarious position now because we didn't solve this problem earlier? What's that mean for us?
That's exactly right. This is why it is important to be to live within your means when things aren't in a crisis. So that way you have the flexibility to act when there is a crisis. You think of it on a small scale, like, you know, there are times where as a family household, you have a crisis and you're going to have to use a credit card to buy some food or take a loan to pay rent. But hopefully you have some savings where you don't go too far in the hole, so that way when you finally get back out, it's not a long recovery. Problem is, the U.S. has just been digging a hole, whether good times are good or bad, increasing that debt, And now we're gonna have to dig that hole way deeper to act, especially with the kind of right now, like the economy is on such a lockdown right now that it's pretty bad, and to provide the support that they're planning to provide is going to be a huge cost. And then again, it's not just the cost of it; it's also going to be the reduced tax revenue that the government's going to be getting over the next few years, right. And also the interest on that debt when interest rates finally do go back up. I mean, it was already in a situation where a small increase in interest rates would pretty much eat up the budget. Far as interest on the debt,
we're paying like $360 billion a year or something, and just interest alone, and that's when interest rates are at record lows.
Exactly. Yeah. And then so basically a small increase is gonna, and so right now it's gonna be cheap because we're gonna go back to zero. So the government will refinance everything to zero. So the interest rate expense will go down for a period of time, and they're going to use that to justify, like, it's okay, we owe it to ourselves. I'm sure you'll hear Krugman say that to.
Yeah, well, it's so cheap. Why not spend it now?
Yeah, it's kind of like when you sit there and say, oh, there's a 0% for 18 months credit card offer. Why not get 10 of these and max them all out? Hey, it's free money.
Oh, how'd you know my finance strategy, Alex?
Yes, but it all comes to roost when that 18 months is over and it goes up to like 14%. And what do you have to do? You have to eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches until you've paid it off. And the thing is that now I don't want to be eating peanut butter jelly sandwiches as a nationwide norm for a very long time. There are ways you get out. There are other ways that ends up getting resolved, but none of them are pretty. The biggest thing anyone can do is just make sure that you want to just be as divested from a need, like if the government were to, let's say, the federal government were to fall apart tomorrow, let's hypothetically, for most people their lives wouldn't be affected at all, because most of the services you get are from your local state governments. Most of the time you're not even interacting with the government in most of your days. So in that case, most people probably wouldn't even notice, and their lives would go up normal. People still going to want to go to work so they can pay rent. Businesses are still going to want to run so they can make money. That life doesn't end. The things that are being impacted is sort of the medium of exchange, like the dollar. I don't want to necessarily be an extreme and say, oh, the dollar will collapse tomorrow. But this will have an impact on the dollar in the long run, depending on relative deficits and other factors.
It's happened to other economies before, though. Like, it's not like it couldn't happen here.
Oh, it certainly could. It certainly could. I mean, one of the benefits the U.S. has that other countries don't is that so much business around the world occurs in dollars outside of the U.S., that there's this sort of demand for dollars outside that kind of, so every time there's inflation, let's say the oil price goes up because we printed a lot of money. Oil price goes up, but that means that everyone around the world now needs more dollars to go buy the oil. So then what happens, that actually ends up, and then that pushes the value of the dollar back up, because now all those countries have to go buy dollars to go buy their oil. So long as a lot of international business is still done in dollars, that kind of provides some support to the dollar. But there's already been hopes of kind of, creating other ways of doing international business, especially now since you have more options. And this is why I love things like cryptocurrency. Like when I take a look at what's going on in Africa's growing gangbusters because cryptocurrency has really changed in a lot of places, offer them really more sophisticated financial infrastructure that wasn't possible before at a much quicker rate. And
but I mean, I'm sure the question that some savvy listeners are going to ask is, well, isn't Bitcoin dropping right now? Isn't it not a good store of value?
Everything's dropping
right
now.
What does that mean for? Or you just say everything's dropping right now.
Gold is dropping right now. So I mean, there's no
toilet paper's up, gold's down. All right, great.
Yeah. No, it's at the end of the day, the biggest store of value is yourself. That's why I always tell people, like, I have money, I have cash, I have gold, I have stocks, I have cryptocurrency, I have varieties of different investments. But the thing that I invest the most in is in the skills and knowledge that I have, because that's the one thing that's always going to be valuable regardless of the environment. Having a diverse set of skills, because then you can find a way to provide value for somebody else to keep yourself afloat no matter what. While assets, people always want assets that are going to make them a lot of money, and there are ways to do that, and I do encourage people to invest in assets, but you got to just hope that people still want those assets later on. You can always figure out, you can always be able to do what other people need and tailor yourself to what people need to always be able to have wealth.
Yeah. Wow. No, I think that's an incredibly important message. Yeah. Just if you keep working on yourself, you're gonna, no matter what the medium of exchange is, you're going to be able to find a way to provide value and to, to collect whatever that medium of exchange is to be able to what do you call it?
Transact, whatever, exchange, whatever.
Yeah, transact. That's the word I was looking for. To exchange for other people who share that same medium. and as you kind of indicated too, this is an interesting opportunity for a lot of people to do that. You know, if you're going to be home, and you know, I think there's an interesting opportunity for entrepreneurs to both sell these types of services to help build it up, and also for, you know, again, you as an individual to say, okay, well, I am not able to go work at the bar or at whatever job you have. You know, what's something I could do to invest back in myself to come out of this even stronger than I was before.
Yep, and there's a lot of opportunity. There's going to be a huge demand for on-demand education. So if there's something you know a lot about, and hey, there's a lot of kids out there who need teachers right now. They need online teachers because they can't go to school. There's going to be a lot of people who are... Oh, sorry. There's a lot of people who are going to be...
I was going to say, New York's closed for... the schools are closed for months, you know.
Yeah. So education's going to be a great space to be in. Same thing with, like, right now. I work in training people to become coders, and I also work as a coder. And there's huge demand there because a lot of people are going to be looking to switch careers right now because basically a lot of things are shut down that you can't do online. And people are looking for ways to new jobs. So there are opportunities out there. You just have to always keep if you keep your skills fresh, you keep your eye out looking for opportunities. There's opportunities right now, and that's the best thing you can do to protect yourself from whatever is to come. Because again, the government's just going to continue to mismanage the budget. They'll continue to muddle along, but at some point, it's going to, you know, things like interest are going to crowd out the budget. They're going to have to push back and pull back all these supports they have. And if you're in an industry that's heavily reliant on government, if you are personally heavily reliant on government, that's going to come back and cause you pain. So you want to make sure that you have the flexibility, the resiliency to thrive in a world where those supports aren't there. That's the big issue. It's going to be more how much that point will affect you will be based on how dependent you are on the status quo.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting thought. You know, so if you can find ways to improve yourself, but maybe do so in a way where you're not reliant on government, either payments or contracts and any of that type of stuff, that might be a solid position to be in. But you know, as we kind of indicate, I think there's really interesting opportunity for entrepreneurs in this space to say, like, okay, how can we're all operating in a new, you know, digital only space, or at least mostly digital space. So how do we adapt to that system? I think that as long as the government doesn't get in the way of doing that stuff, I think it's going to be a really interesting shift in how everything works. Mm-hmm. Now that, again, that's if the government doesn't get in the way and stop some of that stuff. Because I mean, like in the education field, I'm interested in particular because I've seen a bunch of people start to say already, like, oh man, we got to make sure that people aren't shifting over to homeschool or shifting over to, like, let's just educate people online. I mean, to me, I'm like, well, why not? That's an opportunity. You know, both of us have learned online how to get new skills and adapt to a new job. My college degree is in history. I work as a digital marketer.
Mine's in pop culture studies.
See, there you go.
Yeah.
And you were what? You worked in finance for a while,
I trained people.
Coding.
I trained people in finance for 10 years, and then now I train people to code, and I also do coding professionally. So basically, me just being able to learn things online and having tools to teach myself, or people who are willing to offer mentorship, has been pivotal. I mean, a lot of the time, I mean, I'm not gonna sit there and say I never learned anything K through 12 or in college. There's certainly soft skills I picked up, but the skills that really allowed me to pull myself up were a lot of the things that I learned myself because I had a passion to learn. That's why I always encourage people, like, it's not what you know, is that you have a passion to learn and you're able to communicate that passion. Because who wouldn't want to hire someone who, one, can learn whatever they need to learn, and two, can passionately talk about it? Because someone who's passionate about something is someone who's going to do the job well.
That's awesome. All right, so we are out of time. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. What are some places people can find you if they want to keep listening to what you have to say?
You can find everything about me, podcasts, videos, everything over there at alexmerced.com. If you want to learn more about libertarianism, head over to libertarian101.com. If you want to learn more about economics, learn economicsnow.com. Please do get involved with the Libertarian Party over there at lp.org. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, again, Alex, thank you so much for joining us. This has been awesome. We'll definitely have to do it sometime again in the future. Really appreciate your time.
Sure. Anytime. Love it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks again for listening to Radio Free New York. I've been Kevin Wilson, your host for today. Thanks everyone for listening. We'll be back next week.